We're going to start our presentation on the Roaring Twenties. If you look at the top of the slide, you'll see a URL that says Ask a Question. If you have any questions during this presentation, then I will ask that you enter that URL into your device. That should provide me an indication or a notification that you have asked a question, and I will certainly get back to you with a response as soon as possible. This is a new feature of Google Slides, so we're going to give it a try during this presentation. So as we start our discussion about the Roaring Twenties, we need to look backwards in order to move forward. So when we take a look at the start of our nation, we look at the 1700s. This is where our nation was established. Then we move to the 1800s, and this is where our idea of manifest destiny and westward expansion and the whole idea, and this is the 1800s is really when our nation expanded into what we know today. The 1900s, however, was when our nation was really defined. It was an age of invention and innovation. It was a time of 2 world wars, a Great Depression. It also saw social reforms that were instituted by FDR in order to fix the Great Depression. It was not without its strains of organized crime, and there was a fear and paranoia that went along with an idea that communism was going to take over the United States, and that was called the Red Scare. But it was really the 20s that brought the nation alive through music and literature. This is where we see the writings of F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby. You guys all read that in English class, and that really gives us the idea of what the 20s was like. But it was the idea that through fashion and culture and music, that this was really a renaissance of our society, and it really jolted the nation into the modern age. So as we discuss the Roaring Twenties, what we're going to see is that transition from a traditional culture to a modern day culture. We're going to start our conversation with the politics of the 1920s. Before we head into the 1920s themselves, we're going to talk about really what was like right after World War I, 1919, 1918, right in that time frame. And World War I had left much of the American public exhausted, if you will. We know that there was debate over the League of Nations. It really had divided the country. Do we enter into the League of Nations? Do we not? We know that President Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points advocated for the League of Nations, but it did cause a lot of controversy in the nation. Ultimately, we did not enter the League of Nations. Returning soldiers from the war faced unemployment, and those who could find employment ended up taking jobs away from women and minorities. This caused a strain on not only the economy, of course, but on the social lives of people, and that became a problem at the end of the teens, if you will. The cost of living had doubled. This means that it became very expensive to live, especially in cities. And obviously during the war, there was a lot of orders placed both through farmers and factory workers, and business was good. Obviously in times of war, it usually is. Everybody kind of rallies around, and obviously there are greater needs during wartime. But when the war ended, the orders started to diminish. So this had a significant economic impact both on factory workers, but also on farmers as well. So as we take a look at this had really an impact leading into the 1920s. Obviously, there was some concern socially, in society, economically, and these became very stressful conditions for people. And what ended up happening is that many Americans responded by becoming fearful of outsiders. There was this wave of what was called Nativism, and this was a prejudice against foreign-born people, and this is something that swept the nation. Also, a belief in isolationism, basically a policy of removing the United States out of world affairs. Remember that we had just gotten out of World War I. Even entering World War I was a posed a conflict in America. Some people wanted to enter the war, some people did not. If you remember that Woodrow Wilson promised neutrality up until the point where he didn't, and there were several causes of us entering World War I, as we've discussed in the past, where we found that America had no choice but to get involved in World War I. But after World War I, there was this idea of isolationism, which was basically this idea of we're gonna work on domestic affairs and not get involved in world affairs. As part of this nativism, there was also this idea that communism was going to infiltrate our democracy, and they felt that that posed a huge threat to American life, and they felt that the spread of communism would somehow compromise our democracy in the United States. Communism itself is an economic and political system that's based on a single party government ruled by a dictatorship. Now, as we know, our democracy, our Republic of the United States, is not based that way. It is a government for the people, by the people. We actually have a two-party system, and some might argue even more parties with the Green Party, Tea Party, and so forth. But it is not a single party system. We avoided that as we established our Constitution, and we didn't want one party or one group of people governing our nation in fear that there would be tyranny, that there would be a dictatorship. So the founding fathers guarded against that. So after World War I, what we see is a fear of communism, and they thought that the communists would put an end to private property, the owning of private property, and to substitute that with government ownership of factories and railroads and other businesses. In the United States, they were owned privately. And to have the government own that shifts the economy from a free market economy to what the United States has, to something that's called a command economy. And basically what that is an economy that is controlled by the government. And that's what you see in communist countries. So there was this underlying fear that that was going to happen in the United States. So this idea of nativism, this idea that there was this fear of foreign-born people, really led to this fear of communism. And what we're going to see is something that's called the Red Scare. The Red Scare was really a panic in the United States, and it began in 1919 after the end of World War I, but most specifically, it was after the Russian Revolution, after revolutionaries overthrew the Tsarist regime. Vladimir Lenin and his followers, and they were known as Bolsheviks, established a new communist state. And you'll notice the red flag up in the right-hand corner, and that was their symbol. That was their. They were known as Reds, and they cried out for worldwide revolution that would abolish capitalism. And this really made people in the United States, people in America, fearful. They did not want a communist party formed in the United States. They were fearful that that might happen as a result of what was happening in the Russian Revolution. So we see that there is this idea of the Red Scare. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is that you'll notice the heading, the Red Scare, is underlined. That is a web link that will take you to a video and additional information. So feel free to click on that when you get a chance. So through this nativism, and then eventually, as we just mentioned, the Red Scare, there became this idea, or this hysteria, this paranoia in the country. And what we see now are called the Palmer raids. And this is where the U.S. Attorney General, he is the person that kind of oversees law in the country. And his name was A. Mitchell Palmer. And he took into action to combat the Red Scare. He certainly didn't want communism infiltrating into our democracy. So he appointed J. Edgar Hoover, who eventually becomes the head of the FBI, as his special assistant, and what their goal was to hunt down any suspected communists or socialists and anarchists. But what ends up happening is that they end up trampling people's civil rights. They invade private homes and offices, and they jail suspects without allowing them any legal counsel. Obviously, according to our Constitution, that is illegal. That is unconstitutional. You can't do that. Hundreds of foreign-born radicals were deported without trials, and these raids really preyed on the fears of the American people. The way they were able to get away with it is because people were in this feeling of hysteria or paranoia about communism, and they were fearful of anyone who was from another country, in that they may overtake the democracy of the United States. So they certainly preyed on the fears of the American people, and that's why they were able to get away with some of the actions that they did. So during this time of nativist attitudes and this time of hysteria and paranoia in the United States, what we look to now is the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. During this time, it really led to Americans going after foreign-born citizens, and it led to ruined reputations and wrecked lives. Two of the most famous victims of this attitude were Sacco and Vanzetti. They were arrested and charged with the robbery and murder of two men in South Braintree, Massachusetts. That's not too far from where we are now. And Sacco and Vanzetti both asserted their innocence. They provided alibis. The evidence that the police had against them were circumstantial, meaning that it really wasn't sticking. And the presiding judge in the case, the judge that was overseeing them, made prejudicial remarks against them. So what we see in their trial was definitely a lot of bias. And even though they didn't have the evidence against them and they both had alibis about where they were, the jury still found them guilty of these crimes and ended up sentencing them to death. What is interesting about this is, and if you look at the slide, you'll see that purple link down the bottom that says Proclamation of 1977. What this is in 1977, Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts instituted a proclamation that said that Sacco and Vanzetti would no longer be considered guilty. Basically, he cleared the names of both of these men. So if you click that link, which I encourage you to do so, you can see the actual proclamation from Governor Dukakis, basically clearing the names of Sacco and Vanzetti. In addition to all of this, what is also happening at this time is the institution of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution granted the women the right to vote, and it's also known as women's suffrage. And it was ratified in the Constitution on August 18th, 1920. What you have to know is that it was not just 1920 that women wanted the right to vote. This was all through the 1800s. In 1848, the movement for women's rights really started on a national level with the Seneca Falls Convention that was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That's a name that you really need to know and connect to women's suffrage. And there was also a woman named Lucretia Mott. Both of those organized the Seneca Falls Convention. And basically what that convention did was it brought to light on a national level the idea in this movement for women's rights and the women's right to vote. Following the convention, the demand for the vote became a centerpiece of women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Mott, along with Susan B. Anthony, and other activists, raised public awareness and lobbied the government to grant voting rights to women. And after a lengthy battle, those groups finally emerged victorious in the passage of the 19th Amendment. So it was because of those women, specifically Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, that women have the right to vote in the United States today. And that is thanks to the 19th Amendment to the Constitution.